So, yeah, as far as Winston Churchill goes, I'm not sure how many people are enjoying these comparisons between now and World War II, because I think a lot of people, especially like a lot of younger people who were taught the war in history and the Holocaust and all of these horrible things, they, I think, assume that just because the establishment taught them about these wars, that that is something that they can now push aside because they don't really trust the establishment. Nor should
Yeah.
they in a lot of
Yeah.
cases. But that creates kind of like the divide here. But anyway, we'll get into that as well.
So today I'm really delighted to be joined by Lev Polyakov, who I would definitely describe as someone who is of like mind and someone who I think we're going to have an interesting dialogue and a debate with. And unusually, people in the conflict we're seeing tend to stick with their bubbles. And there's always a risk being in your bubble that you're going to be prone to either disinformation, delusion, or narratives that start to deviate from what could be perhaps a more useful reality, a sort of composite reality of different points of view, a complex, a nuanced reality. There's a tendency on all sides to look for simplistic solutions. Lev avoids that, and he tries to introduce people together, especially those who have, let's say, sort of perhaps are in those bubbles, and tries to get them out of those bubbles. But that's my take on it. Please do describe a little bit about your background, why you do this, what's your professional background to all this, and why, because I clearly get a sense of deep involvement and passion, especially for Ukraine and the injustice of what's going on. But yeah, what's your background and your motivation?
Jonathan, first of all, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, and it is a great honor to be here today on your show. As far as how all this started, I actually come from an animation background, but even before that, I was born in Russia. I was born during the Soviet Union in 1988, and my parents and I fled Russia around the mid 90s, 94, and things are actually getting better in Russia at around that time. I recall my dad was talking about how there was a lot more food in the supermarkets and a lot more items being sold, and he also started making more money around that time. But still, we weren't necessarily sure like which way it was going to go. Not too long ago, before that, you had the ballet, I think it was Swan Lake, that was playing on all the Russian televisions because there was that coup attempt and all that. So to make a long story,
93, just a
93,
year before
exactly.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So to make a long story short, I thankfully retained, just through the process of knowing my family and what they have been through, a lot of things that Americans, I don't think, have any idea about, and it's not their fault. They just weren't raised in that environment to understand a lot of these different factors that are totally alien to them. But as far as where exactly I went afterwards, I went to study animation at School of Visual Arts, and I still consider myself an animator, although I have to do a lot more of those kind of things because I made a lot of independent films, went to different film festivals, and I've always enjoyed doing these kind of creative things. But what led me to BTR, Break the Rules, which is the podcast live stream show that I do, is around the pandemic time, I started seeing a lot of pushback from the stagnant culture that was around 2014, 15, 16. I mean, these things are not going to be anything new to you when it comes to a lot of the leftism that was experienced on college campuses, and a lot of the things that honestly the same kind of hesitation that my family saw, and whether we should still remain in Russia. A lot of it also had to do with the history of the Soviet Union, how there were a lot of these thinkers, much smarter than a lot of these social justice warrior students, who had good intentions, who ended up creating a lot of horror. And people from the USSR, I think in general, do see a reflection, and especially people from Eastern Europe, Poland, they do see a reflection of the kind of horrible things that was inflicted on them during the USSR in the mentality, this Red Guard mentality, if you will, of a lot of these students especially back in 14, 15, 16, and continuing obviously now, with the whole Gaza protest students and all of that. So that is one side, and that is a side that was very, very gross to me. And at the same time, you also had people who were in the elites who I did not have as a visceral reaction towards, but like a lot of people who were, very online at the time, again, 2014, 15, 16, going on the internet, especially going to places like 4chan, which are you aware of 4chan?
I'm aware of it. I haven't immersed myself, let's say, deeply in that cesspit, but I'm kind of aware of some of the stuff that comes out of it. And of course, I followed Trump's first term, and of course, there was a lot of talk about these sort of dark web platforms. There was a lot of the QAnon kind of stuff being sort of discussed and analyzed.
QAnon is cringe, by the way. That's the other part of it. That's the internal parts that I don't think are exposed as much, where you have something like QAnon, which came about after there was this general mood of seeking out conspiracies. And the problem is that when you have something as ridiculous as QAnon coming in, anything that may have some legs to it, because I'm sure that there are a lot of horrible things that go on in the background that we're not aware of. That's been the case throughout history all the time. The problem, though, is that when you start smudging it with a lot of things that especially come from the boomers, things that to younger people, especially when they see it, it would look just really stale, really simplistic. It wouldn't have any spirit to it. If that's
let's
one way of
start with
saying it.
that, because this is fascinating to me. It's because, and I have debated quite a few people when the full scale war began. I had some colleagues at work, one in particular who was very much into I would say leftist conspiracy theories, but at some point some of the leftist and some of the extreme right, if you want to put those labels on it, conspiracies kind of merged, and they started almost singing off the same hymn sheet to some extent. And I realized at some point that arguing with this guy, he was drawn instinctively to contrarian points of view. He was drawn to say, look, this is what the broad, segment of humanity is kind of talking about, and the mainstream media and whatever. And he would immediately not just, be drawn to people who are saying things that were different. He would instinctively trust them more than the other.
Yeah.
But that's not exercising any rationality. That is not immersing yourself in context. That is not learning anything about history. That is almost like being drawn to an opposite point of view, like a magnet. But that, to me, is no way to divine the truth. As someone who's got historical training, that's just another way to fall into delusion. And so it proved. I stopped debating who it was mentally and emotionally draining, because I would provide context, or try to, and evidence, and all I would get back is conspiracy after conspiracy after conspiracy, and many of it were clearly traceable Russian narratives as well, unfortunately. And at some point, I'm like, this is not going to go anywhere. And just another point there is someone like Jeffrey Epstein and Andrew Tate. Here you have despicable examples of humanity. You have some of the worst behaviors, and as you say, some behaviors are behind closed doors and have not been discovered, or it takes many years to discover them, like Jimmy Savile's scandal here in the UK, and they eventually come out and it's obscene. Sometimes this behavior exists in plain sight, and yet again there seems to be this attraction to the secret, hidden truth or untruth or whatever it is, and the vileness that exists in plain sight. That's not so interesting.
Well, when it comes to that divide, it affects both parties, because the parties who are supposed to be of the establishment, the so-called responsible elites, they end up going the opposite direction, where they would deny that there are any problems going on. And one thing that can be, united over, I think, is not, well, it is this particular cabal that's responsible for the problems. No, let's actually just focus on the problem specifically, and let's decide as a civilized society, are these problems things that need to be fixed? So, for instance, a really big divide with, the left and the right has been when it comes to migration. And especially, not just, having people, for example, from Ukraine coming in who share a lot of the same values, but if we're talking about people with completely incompatible values, this was the line in the sand that I think separated so many people, and unfortunately got a lot of the people who were against the illegal migration, against the incompatible third world migration, on the side of Russia, which is quite ironic when you think about it. If you're, thinking about all of the Muslim people who are living in Russia, especially like in Moscow, you have all of these, mass prayer events that occur. And also the fact that a lot of them are able to get away with a lot of crimes because Russia's government excuses it, because in a way it uses them as a potential cudgel against their own people. So the complete opposite of what a lot of these traditional nationalist types would ever want to see. But to make a long story short here, a lot of those people who are in the elites, and this is something that J.D. Vance was pointing out, that they end up going after their own people who criticize a lot of these policies when it comes to migration, and it further creates this kind of divide that ends up throwing a lot of people, especially we're talking about people like, Tommy Robinson in England and, Ezra Levant and people like that. It ends up pushing them even more towards getting help from Russian people, Russian money. I'm not saying specifically with those people here, maybe not, but it does end up creating this commonality with people who see the elites as not really putting up their end of the bargain here in the social contract. And this is going to be something that I think down the line, quite shortly in Europe, is going to have to be contended with. Because if we are talking about the values, like what are we trying to preserve? What are the values of civilization that we want to preserve in Europe and the civilized world? Well, there has to be a social contract here, and we have to have responsible elites. And if we don't have responsible elites, this is what ends up happening. So again, with these conspiracies, if we do focus on something that is real and that is tangible, then I think we are able to cut through a lot of this red tape and hopefully unite people, which is what I was doing with BTR, Break the Rules.
And of course, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in Ukraine, you do not, at this point, have such a sense of doubt or even shame about what these core values are, or indeed the sort of weaponized debate about core values that we see in parts of the West, and it's especially weaponized in the US, and it's especially along sort of left-right partisan divides. There are areas where people see their enemies as close to them rather than people who have the same passports, and that is very much, I think, part of this is certainly delusional, and it's certainly extremely unhelpful. You don't get this sense in Ukraine. Because they do have a sort of, common basis of tolerance when it comes to religious belief. And to many in the US, that might be like, hang on a second, aren't they, banning the church? Aren't they doing this? No, you and I have talked about this a lot. It's the Russian church that has been compromised and infiltrated and almost turned into a zombie institution.
The KGB agents.
By the KGB,
yeah.
Whereas in Ukraine, you have multi-dominations, you have Catholic, you have Protestant, you have American evangelicals, you have now, because it's broken away because of Russia's aggression, you have their own sort of Orthodox church, which is far less, in fact, probably not at all, penetrated or weaponized or utilized by the government. Because a lot of people wouldn't tolerate that. It doesn't really work as a sort of, to use that phrase, a kind of cudgel internally in internal political machinations. That's not to say that might not happen if the country is destabilized after a bad peace or something. But at this point in time, it seems to actually embody the ideas of not just religious tolerance and diversity, but also quite a strong religious tradition. So how is it that things that we see in Ukraine, you know, if you've been there and are close to Ukrainian culture, these would seem to be the actual embodiment, the living and breathing embodiment of many conservative values. And yet many conservatives in the US are completely not just unaware of this, they've been convinced that the place that actually does not have these values, which is Russia, is actually, you know, the font and source of all these, as well as Western civilization. I mean, look at the abortion rate, look at the divorce rate, look at the rate of domestic abuse. I mean, you've lived there. I mean, you know that there's a complex reality.
To be fair, I lived there until I was 4, so
there
I
you did.
wasn't
You
personally
didn't really
no.
yes.
I wasn't personally exposed to a lot of these things. But as far as what my family ended up going through and all of that, and you know their friends, there is definitely a wealth of knowledge as far as what exactly life was like back then, as well as what life has been with the people that we were in communication with all this time. For example, Alexander Nevzorov. I don't know if you know Alexander. He was even, you know, part of the Russian Duma back in the day, but he was this rebellious journalist who was one of the first media
I watched
people.
quite a lot of his stuff, so he's quite a. It's difficult. It's complex language. It's very sometimes uses very figurative, very idiomatic kind of language. He's quite difficult to follow for me, at least. But
well, now by the way, he's
he's
doing recordings in English via artificial intelligence.
Okay, yeah,
So,
I'll have to look those up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like the texture and flavor of his language in Russian, though. It's interesting.
But like people like Novzorov, they are an example, I think, of the tendency within Russian culture of Russians to seek Western civilization despite a lot of the problems that are going on in Russia itself. For example, Alexander Pushkin, you know, the great poet, his dream was to go to Paris. And the emperor didn't let him because he knew that once he sets foot in Paris, he was never want to go back to Russia. Yeah, exactly. And Ukraine, I think, is an interesting example here because a big portion of it, you know, the western portion, that was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth back in the day. So they always had this European aspect. But again, going back to this divide, like why are people seeking, you know, Russia? They do see the stagnation of their own elites, and they end up looking at, well, what do the elites hate? You know, who are the elites against? And those are the people that they end up siding with. You know, it's a very tribal mentality. But the problem is that, unfortunately, we do not have good elites that are able to achieve this balance of focusing on a lot of these issues that are going on in the West right now, addressing them, giving the people in the West a reason to want to participate in the system in the first place, and at the same time going against a lot of these horrible things that Russia's doing, as well as just this general third world mixed with China energy, for lack of a better word, that I think would actually unite a lot of people that have the Greek and Roman avatars on you know, YouTube and X, if you know, like the people that I'm talking about, because there are a lot of young people today, Jonathan, that even though their views may be very edgy, you know, because they grew up in this culture where everybody's trying to one-up themselves online, and even though they do probably have more of this fascist mentality, again, you know, doing the opposite of whatever it is considered to be, you know, the right way of behaving, you know, being a young rebel back then, you know, it's almost a mirror image of a lot of these young communists back in the 60s. But anyway, what they do share, which I don't think the communists valued at all, is this love for aesthetics, beauty, you know, like these beautiful statues, and this idea of what does it mean to have honor? What does it mean to live a life where you are able to not just be like one unit in this blob of nothingness, but that you are able to do something to stand out in a good way, be a great example to your community, be somebody who truly embodies a spirit of nobility. And I'm not necessarily seeing that from the people that are in charge right now in the United States, but I do think that when they look at somebody like Barron Trump, for instance, it is all about aesthetics. Like he's this tall guy who's has this face that looks like Alexander the Great. So they're trying to grasp as much as they can a fragment of whatever it is that is close to this ideal that somebody like you saw the Napoleon book I had in the back there, somebody like Napoleon embodied. And it is a double-edged sword, obviously, because a lot of these things could be used to, enact some dictator. But the reason why I mention this is that I do not think at all that the culture of Russia and China and Iran, as it currently is right now, and any of these, aggressive parties in the world are close at all to the embodiment of what a lot of these young people are seeking right now. And I think that Ukraine is actually as close as possible as you can get. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, but say, because I think Ukraine shows, and of course Ukraine is far from perfect, and this is one of the narratives that I constantly struggle against, is people say, yes, but look about this, and there, look at there are corruption scandals, there are this, there are that. You're fighting for an imperfect country. Well, hello. I mean, just look around at the UK, look around the US, look around at every single country. I mean, some have got things a little more right and they have a little more order. And maybe maybe others would perceive freedoms are lesser there, and they trade it for some order and stability. When you mentioned Denmark there, very, very orderly society. And yet, there are certain restrictions there in terms of, you have to surrender all your financial details to the government, which someone in Britain or the US would find far too onerous. But so there's a debate to be had there. When it comes to Ukraine, though, I think there's some very interesting things that they've latched onto, and they haven't fully implemented them. It's not perfect. It's a work in progress. I think that's what the war is being fought for. It's being fought for the right to determine your future. It's being fought for the right to solve your own problems and not have somebody come in and tell you that they have a better solution for your problems and they understand your problems better than you do. That is essentially, I think, what the fight is about. Two things I think that Ukraine has latched onto, which we really need to learn these lessons, because one is, no leader is perfect. So if you go looking for perfection in a leader, that is always going to be a route towards disharmony, and ultimately, at the more extreme ends, totalitarianism. So you must have, you temporarily lend your support to a leader, but it is contingent on them doing a good job, not lining their own pockets, and reflecting the will of not just the majority, but the whole of society. And I think Ukrainians kind of get this. The leader is there only insofar as they represent what is it could be described as the will of the people. The minute they diverge from that, they're gone. And that's absolutely right and proper. And in fact, that is the only real test, I think, of democracy. And this is, Karl Popper talked about this. It's not the process of voting someone in, it's the ability to remove someone from office. That is the essence of democracy. And in that sense, Ukraine has had numerous leaders, for good or ill, over the past period. Russia has had one. So that already is a big, big failure. And anyone who follows somebody who wants to perpetuate their power at the cost of a portion of their populace, I would argue, is not a Democrat. So that's one lesson, which is don't trust leaders. The other one is that oligarchy will always be a route to dysfunction, will always be a route to corrupting whatever could be good in your society. No, Ukraine hasn't done it, perfectly, and it took full-scale war for that effort to accelerate. But they've removed oligarchic ownership from media. Now, the consolidated state-run media that's replaced it has fallen into a couple of traps. It's a little bit propagandistic in that it'll look at stuff that is safe, and it'll try and avoid topics that are not that safe, and it's just become boring. So it's not like propagandistic like TASS or Soviet era television, or dare I say it, some of the sort of more partisan news networks like GB News, even Fox, etc. But it's just kind of got boring. It lacks energy, and it therefore starts to lack authenticity. So they're struggling with these problems and they haven't found perfect solutions. But the idea of getting oligarchic ownership out of our public spaces should be, in my mind, the ultimate in libertarian goals, which is you have media platforms that are truly owned by their communities. I think these are the two lessons. Don't trust leaders, don't trust oligarchs, don't trust monopolies, because they are not capitalistic. They are not in line with conservative values. And we should fight with all our will and organize and learn to trust each other to make sure these three things. And when that happens, that then allows society, that allows people, communities to start self-organizing in a way. That's my sort of vision of what conservative values should be and what the state should be. The state should be there to break up power elites, break up these clots of, like blood clots that stop the flow of blood, which is too much wealth pooling in a certain place in certain hands. My diagnosis here is that the US is falling into all three of these traps: extraordinary concentrations of wealth, real slide towards oligarchy, massive partisanship, and in a certain quarter, uncritical adoration of leaders, Trump and his acolytes. I mean, these are extremely dangerous trends.
Absolutely, I understand what you mean. The only issue that I see here is, and I want to look this up to specifically say how it's how it's written over here. Have you heard of the iron law of oligarchy?
I have not, but it sounds intriguing.
So it's a political theory developed by the German-born Italian sociologist Robert Michaels in his 1911 book Political Parties. It asserts that rule by an elite or oligarchy is inevitable as an iron law within any democratic organization as part of the tactical and technical necessities of the organization. So as a quick example, if you have some kind of church group or whatever, you're going to have somebody in that group who ends up becoming a natural leader, which does not mean that it's like this top-down system like in Russia where, Putin's in charge at the top and everybody else is below. But there are these natural hierarchies that form within any kind of organization. The problem that I see in the United States that existed before Trump, and obviously, with Trump, there are a new set of problems. But specifically, the problem here is that when you would go to Harvard or when you would go to Yale, there wouldn't be any difference between the two. There would be the same kind of mindset. There would be the same kind of cowardice when it comes to certain subjects, because there is this decentralized idea of what is proper according to the progressive religion. And it would be very, very difficult for people to have spoken out against it, which is why you have, for example, University of Austin, that Barry Weiss created, who was somebody who, I consider her to be pretty liberal-minded, but, not ultra-left, who was seeing these dangerous trends that were going on in the universities, which, again, as I said before, like they ended up leading to Trump and a lot of the things that we're currently into right now. But the point that I'm getting to here is that within that system, even though there wasn't this top-down rule, there was this decentralized idea that people who were in the elites were not able to break away from. And I think that in England as well today, when it comes to the migrant situation, certain cities being under the rule of something that considers itself to be timeless and above any kind of Western system of law. These are not things that I think a lot of leaders in Europe and England are able to say something against, and they end up arresting people, Englishmen, who speak out against these things. And I do view it as a kind of cowardice, not from a top-down system where there's, the King of England, like Putin, is going to punish you for, speaking ill about the migrants, but that there is this glue that kind of keeps people in line.
I have to look into that, because I have heard these kind of stories. Mostly I've heard these stories of people being, randomly arrested for just expressing their opinion. I've only heard these stories being thrown around by certain groups. Usually, I've heard it from both sides of the political spectrum. America, yes, but that's Americans criticizing Britain. I haven't heard it too much internally here, but what I need to do is find specific examples to say, okay, hang on a second, why actually was this particular person charged? Was it under hate speech and terrorist legislation, and is there anything genuine behind it? So I'm going to reserve judgment on that one. It's concerning, but
even the word hate speech, by the way, it's a very Orwellian, pardon the phrase, very Orwellian term. Hate speech, the combination of these two words together, and especially if we are talking about a something that, if back in the day you were to tell, whether it's, John Milner, or imagine somebody like Cecil Rhodes. Imagine somebody like Cecil Rhodes going to places where people are living according to their religious law, which is a combination of government power and religious power, completely spitting on any kind of secular law. I think that they would be absolutely outraged. And they
these
would
are
want,
two separate things. Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I think it's important the audience to know this. I'm someone who has huge appreciation for, I think, some of the advances of what I call Western civilization. And I don't think it's healthy to feel guilt or to be sucked into an idea of guilt. It is useful to examine the past and examine the iniquities of the past, but do it in context. And as a historian, question that context, because every generation, the narrative art of telling history changes and perspective changes based on our current values. So, of course, it's complex. So there's two separate things. One, I need to go in and look and say, okay, have people been charged for what could be classed as a reasonable expression of their opinion? Or was there something more behind it? Were they actually trolling or making physical threats of violence, etc.? Because there is a line where free speech is not an absolute, and it can enter an area which could be classed as a criminal code. I'm not saying it's one or the other, but I do need to go away and check this, because everything I've heard so far has been kind of accusation without provision of evidence, and I'm always suspicious of that. On the other hand, I kind of agree with you that there are certain topics which have been considered taboo, and it's kind of interesting when, as you were saying this, someone I greatly admire, Stephen Fry, has come out and said this recently, which is the inability to examine in an evidence-led way and in a way that enables sometimes challenging opinions and not wanting to sort of constantly hide and have your feelings hurt. And let's face it, we see that on the left and the right. We see hurt feelings in relation to Zelensky defending himself in the Oval Office, albeit maybe not in the best possible manner. I mean, people on left and right need to abandon this idea that their feelings cannot get hurt no matter what. I'm sorry, we cannot live in a civilization and not avoid hurt feelings. In fact, the point at which we try to avoid that is a problem. But I also heard something that you said there, especially about Yale, Harvard, and others, churning at people with the same mindset, the same information, the same worldview. I've heard that said by someone called Eduard Limonov, who has direct experience of this. Now, he comes from a very aesthetic point of view. People who may not know, he's sort of gay, is a communist. He's quite an outrageous kind of figure and writer, very typical of the 90s, extremely flamboyant. And I think sometimes aesthetics are far more important to him than logic. But he came up with the same idea, just saying that it gets so boring after a while attending these events where you have graduates from these places because they don't have any original ideas. They have an overweening sense of privilege and status, but they're brought up in a bubble which is frankly really dull, not very creative, and they don't challenge their own assumptions. Now, this is also interesting because this guy has gone on to be a Putin apologist, an imperialist, and a fascist. So he's gone from, I think, quite rightly calling out this herd mentality that prevent certain issues from being discussed and looked at. And I love Peter Hitchens, not Peter, wrong Hitchens. I love Christopher Hitchens. Peter, is a different character. Because he was prepared to shock people, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with him or not. He was prepared to go out and shock people and jolt them out of their convictions and provide sometimes compelling arguments. Again, you may disagree entirely with them, but he would provide really interesting angles on things. So I kind of like that. Someone who's willing to go to battle, not just for the truth, but for not being boring, falling into this.
Someone who I think would be a natural ally then would be Douglas Murray.
I find him Marmite in that some of the stuff he says really strikes me as interesting, and some of the stuff driven by an extreme ideological view of the world. But I don't object to that. I think someone who is similarly Neil Ferguson.
Mm-hmm.
And even Stephen Kotkin, you don't have to agree with people to find them fascinating.
What's the extreme part, though? I'm curious.
Well, it strikes me that sometimes he's saying and doing things to be sensational, almost to sort of, to piss off the people he sees as adversaries. And sometimes he'll say things and you'll be like, hang on a second, can we just go back to the evidence of that? What's the evidence for this point of view? And I think it's fair to constructively disagree with him on certain things, while also looking at things that are fascinating. Another figure which is going to upset a few people on this channel is J.K. Rowling. Yes, she's very conservative. Yes, she can be quite cruel sometimes. I think is the overall take. But she can also be incredibly humane, and she's written a series of books which I think are the most powerful deconstruction of the totalitarian takeover of a society and of institutions, which is the Harry Potter cycle. Extraordinarily perceptive, whether that's all conscious or not. It's a remarkable dissection of how totalitarian thinking can overtake and corrupt institutions. And I think this is one of the problems, isn't it? I'll fire back to you. I'll stop doing anything. Totalitarian thinking is not confined to the right. We have totalitarian thinking on the left and the right, where people cannot, they are allergic to hearing anything from somebody because they've heard something they disagree with, or something that, somehow doesn't accord with their worldview, or even some catchphrase, some little thing, which then means they block out anything that's heard from that person. And I think that's a totalitarian way of thinking, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Now, when it comes to the extreme or sensational things of the aforementioned Douglas Murray, what would you say, in your opinion, would be things that are like that? Or if not specifically, where would it generally lie?
Yeah, I haven't heard enough to pinpoint it, but I do listen to a lot of his coverage of what's happening in the Middle East. There's a good reason for that, because it's very easy to fall into certain narratives. These guys are good, these guys are bad. From my own personal connection to the region, I know that it's intensely complex and nuanced. And I think what I value in Douglas Murray is sometimes, it's the challenge to that status quo thinking and sort of herd thinking, or this falling into the good guys, bad guys kind of thinking. What I most value about him is also the stuff I disagree with, because it can help sharpen what you feel. I mean, I've always personally felt that Netanyahu is not a great leader, tends towards oligarchy and self-interest and corruption, and his incompetence is sometimes by design, because that incompetence can sabotage nascent peace processes. So I find him a very divisive figure. To my mind, is the wrong person at the wrong time in history. And I'll go out on a limb here. I've got a lot of Israeli friends who aren't going to like this, but there are certain actions which do not accord with international law, and nor can they be justified from a strategic point of view. In fact, often they make the region less secure than more secure. That isn't to say all the other stuff about Hamas and it being a criminal brainwashing gang which essentially feasts on its own population to incite genocide for its own political and economic gains for the leadership. So it's intensely complex. And I think what I like about Murray is he challenges some of the perceptions you might have, but he also helps to refine and hone the arguments you believe in, because he's come at you with something that you kind of think, okay, that doesn't accord with my version of reality, but he's expressed it incredibly well, right? I'm going to have to up my game if I'm going to have to argue against that. But I think, that's that culture of wanting to be challenged by things you object to is one of the problems of why we are where we are.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Not wanting to get into that,
It does get into the core, I think, of what's going on here, also going to Russia and Ukraine right now. Because let's say what we were talking about right now with Israel and Gaza and all of that, if we were to apply the same thing to Ukraine and Russia and say, well, let's dissect this, like nobody's an angel here. Obviously, that sounds ridiculous, knowing that the pressure is on, time is running out, and we have this aggressor which is completely ugly in spirit and actions, that is doing horrible things. While Ukraine is bombing the refineries, they're bombing hospitals, where civilians are. Yeah. So to me, it's not something where I could say that, well, we need to look at every little fragment that's going on, in Russia, and, seek out all of these different areas of corruption in Ukraine, which probably America is going to be doing right now, because of
the FBI, Kash Patel.
Yes, exactly. But I think that what this says to me is that a good balance of what it means to be civilized is that in situations that are dire, in these very, emergency type situations, you're never going to have an ideal. You're going to, at a certain point, have to draw the sword. And when we're talking about drawing the sword and what that means for Europe as well, the only reason I would ever see people in Europe, because now we're talking about, Europe having its military and helping defend Ukraine and all of that. The only reason I see something like this potentially working in the long term is if the people who are, like the people of England, people who I've been friends with for a long time, who grew up, not too far from where the Beatles grew up, and Nottingham particularly. That's a city a friend of mine lives, and all his life he's been told that white people are evil, and that British culture is the suppressive imperialist thing, and he was told that this was the environment that he grew up in. And when it comes to the question of why should he care about England, what is there to care about in a country that looks at its own people like garbage? And I'm not saying that's the case, but that's the mentality, right? Like,
it's
why
unfortunate as well, because of course that's not my experience. Growing up in England.
You are older, to be fair. Like he's younger than me. He's in his late 20s.
Right. Yeah. The full discussion of the imperial past it is already starting. And I think it's actually a beneficial process to look at the nuances and complexities of history and look at the bad stuff, right? Because God, there is a lot of bad stuff, but even in the bad stuff, there's often points of interest and complexity that are worth being acquainted with. Mm-hmm. But this attitude of feeling shame, feeling revulsion at your own culture, I think is not helpful, and also it prevents us recognizing that actually what actually is our own culture. I mean, my background is part of my family fled Nazism in Central Europe. The other half fled British imperialism in Ireland, and actually came to Britain and found a haven here and built a life here. So things are complicated. Things are complicated, and most people in Britain have multiple roots, whether you go back many generations and it's Scandinavia or whatever, or you go back a few and it's French Huguenots or whatever. We're a very mixed people. So again, narratives that make us feel shame about being English, they fail on two levels. One, they label us simplistically as English, as if that's a simplistic thing, and here are a set of finite characteristics that must be associated with it, and you must feel shame at those, and you don't. It fails on both levels of nuance, and is not helpful in any way. So I would say your friend here is being double gaslighted, not just from one side.
As far as the bad things that occurred, I'd say that pretty much every single nation, every single empire, including the multitude of empires, mini empires, mind you, that existed in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah,
all
the history of the world is a history of
yeah,
empires. The history
absolutely.
of the world is a process of empire building to get to the point where we are now. And the British Empire, for all its faults, and I think empire by its very nature is a rapacious vehicle. Some people will be advantaged and some will be disadvantaged. The problem is we can't know what the alternative history would have been, or what those countries would have been like, or what opportunities would have existed. Maybe there would have been fewer, maybe there would have been more. But an empire like the British one, built on trade, mercantilism, and a certain economic rationality, will create opportunities for some people in those societies that included in the empire. But there comes a period where that mode of existence gets in the way of creating wealth, gets in the way of creating plurality. So, of course, the age of empires ended, and it had to end, because I think we came to a view that something better can supplant that. And that is the idea that there are certain inalienable human rights, that there are certain inalienable freedoms, and that small countries should have a right to self-determination, and not just be under the sphere of influence of larger bodies. And for about 80 years, I think we were moving towards a more civilized, productive, and innovative way for human society to be organized and structured. And now we are rapidly retreating from that. I mean, that's the big picture, I think.
If we apply the law of the iron law of oligarchy to this new world post-British Empire, I'm not sure we get independence as much as dependence on the enemy. And by the enemy, I would mean the USSR. And today, I would say the enemy would be China and Russia. Meaning, I don't think that, unfortunately, in this interconnected landscape of, air travel and, quick communication, there is such a thing as any kind of power that's completely sovereign, that's completely independent.
No, there isn't. No. And that's the nature of the complex technologies we're building. And maybe that wouldn't be such a problem if China and Russia hadn't lapsed back into personal authoritarian rule. There's a period, recently in Chinese history where there was more of a collective rule and a certain type of internal quasi-democracy, at least within the party. And I'm not saying it's a democracy in the sense we'd recognize, but it's a democracy in the sense that different opinions within the Politburo would be heard, considered, and more of an evidence-based approach will be taken. Ironically, Russia, during the Zastoy period in the 70s, had far more, I would say, of a it's not a democracy, of course.
Checks and balances.
It had more checks and balances than it does now.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the key, is building in checks and balances and building in mechanisms to stop power, wealth, and influence pooling in certain places, because that's hugely deforming. Why are we at where we are now? one of the reasons is because, and I worked in it. One of the reasons is because Silicon Valley rose, and it created more wealth in fewer hands than at any other point in history. But it also happened that, unlike the sort of oil barons and so on, where that would control sort of logistics and industry, this new age of vast wealth and pooling of technology is also intimately associated with information. So we've never faced this conjunction before in history, and unfortunately, we are drastically failing. The fact that Trump has almost instantly sort of coerced all of the major tech oligarchs and their platforms, and they are now little more than, supine lapdogs for whatever happens. Whether the Tsar is benevolent or whether the Tsar is evil doesn't actually matter at this point. Huge amounts of power with no checks and balances are now in the hands of people who do not understand the complexities of politics, have no understanding of context or history. I've met and spoken with a lot of these people. They're engineers.
Yes.
They do not understand the nuances of history. They just don't get it.
Well,
they want simple technical solutions to complex problems, which works partly on the internet, does not work in politics, society, and culture. And there's nothing really to challenge them, and they have no backbone or framework to be part of any resistance to tyranny. And
your microphone is your camera is fogged, by the way.
Oh,
there's fog on your camera right now. I don't know if it's there. We go.
There
Perfect.
we go. The sun's come out. Very odd.
Very odd for England.
In the UK. The sunshine.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go on the tangent here, but it is quite interesting how the lack of sun, like the cloudiness, the dreary weather, in a way, it does perhaps lend itself to creating this culture full of some of the greatest humor, literature of all time, if we're talking about England over here. That's just like a side. But actually, it's not that much of a side now that I think about it, because what you were saying about this mercantile class of these Silicon Valley people online, where we have people like Vivek Ramaswamy talking about, the grind set and all of that, completely empty, just working for the sake of working, acceleration for its own sake. If we go back to people like, for example, what was his name? Alfred Milner of the Milner Group, who was working with Cecil Rhodes at the time. There was, they had this society of people who were obviously well connected to a lot of the British aristocracy as well. If we're talking about like the Cavendishes and, the Cecil family. These were people who had a really high idea of what it means to be an Englishman, of what it means to perpetuate the ideas of honor and things of that nature. And even though that they were mercantile in their own way, I think that they were still closer to this kind of aristocratic, honorific, honor-based values that the aristocracy was supposed to.
I mean, they would have been taught classics. They would have had a grounding in history and context. And one could say that, okay, that is a form of imperial history which reflects a certain point of view and certain interests. But their view of the world is innately more complex than many of the simplistic, extremely shallow routes, which I think a lot of people debating now have, unfortunately. And of course, they'd have been aware of not just Roman, but Greek history. They'd have been aware of all these concepts of democracy and tyranny. They'd have been aware of the extraordinary sort of chaos of the periods in Roman history where, things fell apart. And I think, if we were able to sit down and talk to them, they wouldn't see the world in ideological senses, partisan ideological frameworks that unfortunately have become very prevalent now. They wouldn't be divided into a sort of, vicious left-right thing, even if the sort of, Whigs, Tories, Liberals, etc. They would have had a far more nuanced and probably thrilling and interesting view of the world than many now do.
And I think a lot of young people are seeking those kind of people out, or at least trying to embody that. Unfortunately, the closest that they're able to get to people like that would be people who unfortunately also have this petty oligarchic essence, but that is because it's like water in the desert. When they see a figure like Trump who doesn't excuse his sense of grandioseness, to a lot of these younger people, they don't have anybody else. This is the guy. And instead, when they see a lot of these more liberal minded politicians who don't address a lot of the problems with crime, migration, etc., they see people who have completely let down this social contract. They may not phrase it as such, but they believe in the cycle of history. I'm curious what you think about it. It's very basic. The cycle of history is strong men make good times make weak men make hard times make strong men.
I think that's a nice phrase, and there's a certain if it's applied to institutions, I think that is certainly true. And what we see is a number of leaders who've been, come from certain institutional backgrounds. So I think, again, the focus, I think, is deceptive to look at the men themselves. They are a representation of the institutions that they're a part of, the parties, the classes, and the groups. And it's a more interesting question as to, what kind of ideas and innovations are being injected into this system, or how far does it exist just to perpetuate the status and prestige of the people involved in it? How authentic is it, or how much like a simulacra or a sort of cosplay has it become? And I think, our democracy has become a kind of cosplay of democracy, where the people are pointing at their leaders going, "You're not leading us." And the leaders are under the delusion that everything is far more tickety-boo than it really is. Whereas what Ukraine shows, I think, is, well, that's wrong on both counts. Both are wrong in this instance. One, unless you hold your leaders to account, unless there is a deep sense of democratic involvement by the people and a deep cynicism towards leaders, then everybody is wrong in that system. In the other system, you cannot just point at the leaders and say you've failed. It is by its very nature a failure of people to really engage with the fight themselves, to educate themselves, to organize themselves. And this is where Russia comes in. Because Russia, despite all of the complexities, and we could, I have talked for 3 years, 600 conversations, it's an infinite well of stuff to talk about, but actually the mechanics are very, very simple. When they cut through the Tsarist period, they cut through the USSR, and they're especially prevalent now. And that is divide and conquer. Divide your enemies. You unite with one to destroy the other, and then you unite with their enemy to then destroy them. Divide and conquer is a very simple mechanic, and we see that playing out. The other one, if you were going to control Russia, if you're going to control its resources and leech off them, and actually the history of the Muscovite Empire is a history of parasitism on the resources of the country, and that includes the people who are seen as no more than a resource. You have to develop certain tools to be able to do that. Yes, you have to have, an administration, etc., etc. What you really need is a siloviki. You need your forces to protect the loot. And then you need your own private forces. Yeah, you need your own forces to protect yourself against in case the siloviki turn against you. You need to divide and conquer. You need to create stories that make sure no one trusts each other. And it all comes down to trust. If you're going to carry on looting in this system, the minute people start trusting each other, they start organizing. The minute they start organizing, it's over. Either, and this is because your mindset is deeply paranoid, they're going to come and steal everything off you so they can behave like you. Unfortunately, I think most of the Russian systemic opposition actually fit in that category. Yeah, democracy, but really they want to take over the system. But also someone might arise who may genuinely try to sort of deconstruct that operation. The one thing you have to do is to stop people trusting each other. Now we see this projected, and we've opened ourselves up to this. Our democratic systems are ripe for manipulation, and the left-right paradigm that lacks historic context, the where people doubt, their history and their values and their identity, and you weaponize the environment. Well, this is absolutely the perfect environment for Russia's simple imperial mechanics to take hold. And we're seeing them, we're not saying that Russia's created all these problems, absolutely not. But boy, we're seeing them utilize it to the nth degree, turning left against right, Democrat against Republican, turning neighbor against each other. They are expert at that, if nothing else. And one of the phrases that came out recently, they don't understand how democracy works, but they understand how it fails. And that's part of the problem.
Well, they definitely are doing that and supporting both the far left and the far right, as well as weaponizing migration, which is something that, for example, Finland encountered, I believe a year or so ago. There was a story about how Russia was bringing in migrants from sub-Saharan Africa right to the border of Finland on bicycles. And this is something that, again, a lot of these traditional people who, mistakenly look at, strong Russia bear, when they look at that state, they expect to have this opposite of what they perceive to be degeneracy and decline and, the lack of respect for the people that you're supposed to govern on behalf of the Western elites. And like I said before, they're not wrong.
How would you apply this to the US? Because it seems to me that through criminal gangs, through China, through the fentanyl trails, and by curious irony, it gets forgotten that actually Biden was one of the people who really started to crack down on these fentanyl routes. But of course, we'll ignore that. It seems that via its proxies and assets, the major totalitarians are using migration and illegal migration, and especially, people who, as you say, may come from rural backgrounds, may come from extremely religious, conservative, rural backgrounds in their own countries, and that makes it quantitatively far less likely they're going to integrate, and it makes it more likely there will be some problems there. It seems to me that a lot of this stuff, some of it's accidental, but it seems there's a lot more of this destabilizing effect by design. And this almost is not discussed, it seems, in the US because it's such a useful political football. So again, I'm not saying we shouldn't debate it, because there's a really interesting debate to be had there about integration and about the weaponization of immigration. The trouble is both sides are intent on using it as a football, because the Democrats tend to be quite sort of weak and tend to come to knife fights with spoons. They're not really effective at weaponizing it, and the GOP is fantastically effective, Trump especially. But if we don't see enemies of America as playing a key role behind this immigration, then that's never going to get solved, and unity is not going to be achieved.
The Mexican embassy, for instance, from what I understand, has a lot more Russian agents within it than the Brazilian one, even though Brazil is a part of BRICS.
Yes, of course, there.
And if we're thinking about all of the caravans and all of these things that were in the news, before Trump got elected, this is absolute fodder for people who want to change the system. But again, it takes two to tango. And what's been allowed to happen in the United States and Europe, with Merkel especially. And yes, Putin has a lot to do with this too, with the destabilization of Syria. But again, like I said before, takes two to tango. And that's why, like I keep saying here, the only way I think there could be for the long term, obviously right now this is indeed an emergency, what's happening with Ukraine, but in the long term, the Europe that would be one that would have its people defend its values would be one where the people themselves, those who share in the same civilizational values, regardless of whether you're from Ireland or Scotland or wherever, they have to make sure that the elites hold up their end of the bargain. Where the elites,
and I'd say from India, because as the case here, I mean, there was some fairly sort of weird and scurrilous accusations of someone. Actually, I think it's Konstantin Kisin, who's an interesting figure, someone who I sometimes like what he says, sometimes I find it deeply objectionable. And, you know, this is where it gets sticky, isn't it? Because
Yes.
someone like Rishi Sunak, I object to him because he's a plutocrat and an oligarch. But he is more English than I am in his idiom and his dress and the culture he's adopted. So when this issue, you know, gets cut along sort of skin tone lines, that's where it gets problematic. But I think there is a strong debate to be had here about culture. I also think it's perfectly possible. You know, why can't someone who's white have pride in Irish nationality and a certain awareness of that culture, and yet pride in being British and live in Britain? I know many people who exactly embody that, and it's perfectly normal if they're white. Well, why can't Rishi Sunak have an awareness of his ancestral culture and be as British as they come? I mean, that's a form of dual standard, which is simply racist. But when we can't talk about the problem of mass immigration from rural communities where you might have hardline, extremely conservative religious views, that is incredibly destabilizing. Now, I'm an absolutely militant atheist, so I would point to all forms of extreme religion as being destabilizing if what you want is a tolerant and pluralistic society, and indeed an open one. But there are levels of toxicity, right? And even within the same religions, there are levels of extremism that go on. Some things that are beneficial, and it's a sliding scale between them. The trouble is, for economic gain, we have, I think, brought in many people who would find it very difficult to integrate, and then we haven't built those structures to encourage that integration. And of course, it's destabilizing. You know, the best case outcome is they just live their lives quietly, don't integrate, and then maybe their children and grandchildren, as often happens, integrate better. The worst case scenario, of course, is that they are prone to be weaponized, as we saw, you know, during the height of Al Qaeda's campaign. And yet there's an allergic reaction to even broaching these issues. I think that's what you were talking about earlier, isn't it? It's just
absolutely.
Inability to discuss in any evidence-based way when it comes to, you know, race and immigration.
Well, there is also another aspect here, which is you have different circles of influence, you know, one within the other, where you can have people who can be cordial and friendly and maybe invite you, you know, into their house for dinner. But at the same time, those same people would be the ones that would be standing outside aimlessly, you know, looking at somebody of a different sexual persuasion, if you will, being thrown off a rooftop. And those people would just be looking like deers in the headlights, watching it, and then going home and doing something else, where they wouldn't do anything about it because within their religion, that is not a problem for acts like that to be done. And the real issue here...
I tend not to go for tea with people.
Yes, exactly.
But, no, I get the point there.
But there's one more point here, which is very important. The issue here has to do with how... You know, I know you're in England here, how certain things are written. Because if you have something that has been passed down from generation to generation, from, you know, master to disciple, if you will, and when you have certain figures that have codified how you're supposed to act when it comes to morality, when it comes to how you wage war, when it comes to all these things, and if you are not able to excise these bad elements away from the potentially good elements, then you have a structure which is both a religion and a political system at the same time. And that is not something that a civilian who is living under that system has any control over, even if they are the nicest person in the world. Which means that in the future, if we're talking about certain places in England and Europe, if that kind of religious plus political influence comes to power, people could be completely completely sedentary, not wanting to hurt a fly. But if that is the system that they are accepting of and the system that they are willing to live under, and those are the people that they are then going to be supporting, that is extremely dangerous to what I think the West wants to, live in.
I'd have to say I would be equally allergic to militant Christianity as I would be to Sharia law or any form of militant Islam. And the problem I have is that at its best, religions create a sense of cohesion and community, and they engage in discussion about morality, which is often absent in secular environment. Not even the fact that here's things and you've been told what to do. That's not the essence of it. In fact, that's kind of unhelpful. But it's an actual engagement in moral discussion, as opposed to just living a material life. And that's one of the, I think, issues that has not been tackled by secularism. It has not found a way to introduce these conversations and the dynamic. I think my experience of Jewish life suggests that actually there's they've had a little more success at doing that, because you can be a secular Jew, you can be an atheist Jew, you can still be involved in some of these discussions which have a moral dimension,
because they wrestle with God. That's what Israel means, to wrestle with God, not to submit, not submission. And that is well, that's literally what Islam means. So that is the big difference here, where even with Christianity, like you were talking about extremism in Christianity, sure, absolutely that exists, but it is within Christian thought that render unto Caesar what is Caesar, render unto God what is God's.
The division of church and state.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And that applies, I mean, that's one of the worrying aspects of Trumpism is the symbols or the gestures towards religiosity that are becoming almost an essential feature. You have to show loyalty, and yet the actual morality plays no role in the thinking process and the planning process. I think it's fair to say that morality is not part of Trump's makeup or thinking process or planning process or strategizing, and yet to show loyalty you need to do the right genuflections and so on. So that's a concern, and anyone who sought to impose that, I think I would see as a dictator, just in the way that there's the most extreme interpretations of whether it be Christian or Islam. The worst example is God is the ultimate dictator, spying on you, getting involved in every aspect of your life, demanding fealty.
God is the police.
God is the police. He doesn't want you to question his authority or discuss anything or think for yourself. So that's the sliding scale of the worst. At its best, it's a catalyst for thinking about things and engaging in dialogues, but with the idea that not everything's relative. There is some right and wrong. Now let's discuss what that is, rather than relativism, moral relativism, saying, well, there cannot be a right and a wrong, and let's, it's all material.
But even what you're saying here, Jonathan, what you are pointing out are conversations that were had by the likes of, all of the great Enlightenment thinkers and Thomas Jefferson, all of these people that we look up to as these demigods, if you will. But the problem is that, going back to the example of China under Deng Xiaoping, where it was not under him officially because they had this flexible system, yet it was because of him that the system was flexible as it was. Again, the iron law of oligarchy. The problem is that you are always going to have some people in the elite who are going to set a certain tone and who are going to hold on to the reins of power so as to ensure there is going to be this flexibility. And the problem comes about that when it's too flexible, when it's too tolerant, you have Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, where those who are intolerant are able to make use of the tolerance and assume power. And what you were talking about with Trump and the whole loyalty thing absolutely rings true. What the MAGA supporters would say, though, is that a lot of these structures that were built into the state, you know, the beast of the state, when it comes to all these different government workers, they were also in this mode of patronage, where there was this idea that if I follow this particular system, if I keep my mouth shut, then I'm going to get promoted. And the system of patronage is alive and well in all of these fields.
That always grows. It's like it is inalienable law. I mean, you get that in business.
Yeah.
The nice thing about business is that when that goes too far, your company becomes less efficient and the margins go down and your products become less interesting and you get wiped out by a competitor. So this is the key that's often, I think, left out of this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It's competition. What oligarchy and monopoly and some of the stuff we're seeing does is it seeks to use the language and the structures of capitalism. Look at this, freedom, 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 freedom. What they do in reality is reduce the levels of competition in their sphere and their environment, and they seek to subvert the framework and the rules in order to eliminate competitors. And that's essentially what this kind of eventually comes down to is, let's not look at the words, let's look at the actions. Let's even, I'd say, look at the aesthetics of what's going on. And I've had these, many arguments with Joe Lindsley and others about this. And Doge, yes, maybe something like that process is essential and required, like a constant trimming or pruning of this sort of, knotweed of bureaucracy, which inevitably comes about. But is that what we're seeing? And is that the very purpose? Or what are we seeing? Are we seeing a wrecking ball that is no longer beneficial to US governance, but is beneficial to a foreign power? So I'm not necessarily saying that the process itself isn't required. I'm questioning whether the right people are carrying out the process in the right way for the right motivations. And unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion that they're not.
Well, the right people, I agree with you, they're not right, but they are right in the historical sense, in the sense that if we do view the trends that came about before them, it almost does make sense. So, of course, we're not going to have Thomas Jeffersons that are going to be following this.
The key, isn't it? Again, I don't believe in revolution. This is why what's happening is remarkable. For people who are carrying this out to think of themselves as conservative, what's actually happening goes against, I think, all sort of common sense definitions of what conservative means. Conservative means incremental change, preserving what works, having a sense of continuity, but rejecting what doesn't work, and aiming to have a small, more efficient state in that process, but it is retaining the good and rejecting the bad. Now that's the ideal. It doesn't always work in practice. I don't think that's the process we're seeing working out here. We're seeing the baby and the bathwater being chucked out, but I don't see no evidence of, the shining new city that's going to replace what's being destroyed. And it feels like a process of vandalism as opposed to a renovation of a fine building.
Well, I mean, as far as the government workers themselves, again, maybe this is because of, coming from the USSR and just seeing how far this kind of structure, with big government ends up going, with the history of communism and all that. I don't think it's a problem to have far less people within those fields. I don't think they're extraordinary people. In fact, a lot of the people from the quote-unquote deep state, like the CIA, that we have been seeing, who were complaining about a lot of these things, are, from Reddit. And this could be a bias on my part here, but with the whole 4chan versus Reddit dichotomy over here, the people who are the most active in Reddit and the Reddit moderators, they are looked at as being very predictable, completely unromantic, unspiritual people who love, the superhero movies and all of this consume type culture, and they don't take after themselves. They smell bad, and just like they have polycules. Do you know what a polycule is?
No.
A polycule is when you would have several people that would live together like couples, as a multi-amorous type of situation. And what usually ends up happening
How much of that goes on in real life, though? Let's be
well, among a lot of these Redditors, apparently quite a lot, where you would usually have like this rather large-looking woman who would have a lot of these very small, skinny men around her, in this polycule. And, these are people who live in their own bubble. And I don't know how many of those people were within the quote-unquote deep state, but if people like that were making up a lot of the people that were in charge of policy, much like a lot of the people who are around the Biden administration, I don't want those people to be in charge of a dog. But to the point of what you were talking about, what exactly should be retained would be the kind of people that can sense the threat that Russia and China pose, as opposed to handing over state secrets to entities like Russia. That is absolutely clear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess some of these, not even solutions, but some of the problems come back essentially to education, which have been undereducated, to not studying history, to maybe learning a sort of warped or weaponized version of history, as opposed to a process of free inquiry, and not having an understanding of the deep roots of Western civilization, and then being able to compare it to other civilizations and look at things and say, okay, well, there's some things here that we can find fascinating and admire, and there's some things here which are absolutely in contravention of what should be our values. But it comes down to ultimately ignorance, I think, in many quarters, whether we're looking at the sort of so-called left, so-called right, and extreme self-interest. And the other point that struck me always is something I find objectionable in British society, and there are different ways of organizing society, and it ultimately comes down to the tolerance you have. But here, your education, your accent, your comportment will count for quite a lot. People will constantly try to place you in a certain hierarchy, but it's based on how you sound, maybe how sophisticated you might sound.
My friend said the exact same thing, by the way. Growing up in working class England, his mother was Irish, and he had a more sophisticated accent, if you will, than the rest of his group there. So.
It can lead you into problems, right? You can listen to what Boris Johnson says, and actually on Ukraine he makes a lot of sense. On everything else he makes almost no sense whatsoever. But you can listen to the accent and the sophistication of the phraseology, and it's like, wow, this is clever stuff. Whereas if you parse it, it's about as much of a word salad as Trump stuff, quite honestly. But you can fall into, so there are weaknesses in that whole thing, and it's not always great. You walk into a room and you get judged, and that's not the whole picture reality. But there are certain characteristics and criteria on which people judge things, or will try to place you in that hierarchy. In the US, it struck me, and this is again an extreme it's extreme version of this, because not everyone's going to behave like this. But I worked in Silicon Valley for some time, and I had a lot of trips over to the Valley. And it struck me that I could get away with stuff because people couldn't place me. Like with the British accent, it completely confuses them. They're like, he dresses like a tramp, but he sounds quite sophisticated, right? I don't know what's going on here. Right, we'll give him a free pass. But if I was American, I would be judged on a lot of the physical ways I dress, and maybe my watch, and maybe this, and maybe that, or certain characteristics. And some people would be judging and trying to figure out whether you are above or below them in the pecking order based on material, monetary criteria. And no, that's not going to be everywhere, but I got a distinct sense of a different value system that's used to try and create a sense of pecking order. Now, some people, won't do that. Some people don't think like that and act like that. But these are sort of, that's the impression I kind of got there. And it seems to me that Trump is an extreme embodiment of that. Extreme embodiment. I've seen people actually in Europe, especially in business, who think like this as well. I think he'll look at people and he'll be judging, is this person more powerful than me? And if I emulate them, can I become more powerful? And I think that's how he looks at Vladimir Putin. This guy, wow, he gets respect, he gets results, he uses violence, and he's powerful, right? I could learn some stuff from this guy. Or he looks at them, are they richer than me? And these are the two criteria he'll look at. And if you don't fit into that, if he perceives you to be weaker or poorer than him, you will not be treated as a human or a peer. And this is one of the problems with Zelensky. For many reasons, he sees him as weak, and he sees him as poorer than him. And none of the leadership qualities we admire of Zelensky are things that fit into his value system at all. This is one of the problems. So when Vance, I think knowingly, lobbed that little, verbal grenade in there, he was trying to trigger a reaction, not just in Zelensky, but trigger a reaction in Trump that he knew was going to come, because fundamentally he understands how Trump sees Zelensky, a kind of unpleasant necessity, but in no way a peer, or even someone who could be accorded respect in any way. I don't know. Does that strike you as simplistic, or is there something there?
I'm curious about the upper class aristocracy in England, let's say, and how they would perceive somebody like a Vladimir Putin, not the current aristocracy, but if we go back 300 years, 400, 500 years.
Well, we still have aristocrats,
Sure,
I've met a good number, so we can still judge, because I think there are some parallels that don't really change.
I don't think they'd mind the dress of Zelensky. In fact, Winston Churchill was wearing a military dress because Britain was under fire at that time from the Germans.
They wouldn't care at all. And this is the irony, is if you're trying to be part of their set, if you're trying to pretend you're part of their set, then they're not going to accept you. And that might piss certain people off if you're aspiring to be part of that group. But if you were in their home and you were dressed like Zelensky was, and you're clearly your own person and, in your own sphere, well regarded, and you're not sort of trying to be something you're not, then I do not think that judgment would be there at all. And this is the for me, and this is again it's a personal experience, the hallmark of British aristocracy is you don't have to try too hard, because you've already got it, whether it's power or wealth or whatever. You don't have to overtly demonstrate it and slap people in the face with it.
I guess Vance is the opposite of that.
He's the opposite of that. Trump's the opposite of that, unfortunately, as well.
A little bit different, though. Here's what I'd say. Vance came from a really, really poor, really, really tough environment growing up. And I think that creates a chip on your shoulder. I also don't think it helps when you have a lot of these pundits, talking about, the hick working class of Appalachia and, demeaning people like that. Because that appears to be fair game for a lot of people, who want to vent this element of sadism that they may have towards people, but understand there are certain protective groups that they cannot talk about. So they end up talking about, like the poor white people. And denigrating them.
It's a complete red herring, isn't it? Because really what you should be looking at is, what are his actions? What are his words? What is and in this case, you could use the word with quite a bit of justification. What is his value system? Does he even have one? And what is the hypocrisy that you can discover? Is he consistent in his views? or is he formulating, you know, his power purely based on pursuit of power itself, pursuit of prestige? And looking at his utterances over the last few years, I come to the conclusion that this is someone that will do anything for proximity to power, anything for his own personal aggrandizement, simply because he's contradicted himself so many times. The background is neither here nor there. And I think the other thing that struck me is, you know, if you're upwardly mobile and you want to project yourself as someone who is wealthy and whatever, or you want to pretend you're in these upper middle class or even aristocratic circles, you might try too hard. You know, your sofa might be too new, your carpet might be. Whereas if you go into some of these older houses with people who have you know, genuine aristocratic things, you'll go in there and there'll be dogs on the sofa, and the sofa will be 100 years old and it'll be falling apart.
Yeah, and they drive an old car.
They drive an old car, and the carpet might smell a cat pee and whatever. And
yeah.
There's just
they're above trying to impress.
They're above
other
trying
people.
To impress.
Yeah,
that's right. And it may be that they see you as not of their station or whatever. But they're not gonna go set out to humiliate you, or they'll be quite happy that you're your person in your sphere and in your circle. Just don't, you know, pretend to be something other than you are. And they'll be hospitable, and they almost certainly won't insult a guest that they've brought into their house. That was the other aspect, and one of the more interesting commentaries on what I saw with Zelensky. It's when you bring someone into your house, and that's what was happening there. This is the White House. This is not only the seat of American democracy, but it is also the place where Trump resides. Just a common courtesy is not to demean and humiliate your guest, even if you fundamentally disagree with them. And that just lacked a common decorum and decency from my point of view, what went on there.
It's expected, again, I would say, because of this shift from where there was this decorum, but at the same time, there was also this perception, at least a lot of the people who were against the Biden administration and the people around him perceived this weakness, or something, for example, like two men who were, you know, sorry to be blue over here, but they were having, you know, homosexual intercourse with each other in one of the cabinets there in Congress. And how that was just not talked about, swept under the rug, you know, it's not a problem. And like little things, I'm not that that's a little thing, but things of that nature show the people on the other side that if they're going to fight dirty in the sense of not upholding these golden standards, decorum, then why should we? And this is the situation we're stuck in right now. It's a very regrettable situation. I just don't know how we're going to get out of it without experiencing a certain degree of pain.
No, pain is, and Ukraine has shown that pain is almost an essential element. If we, this is probably where we'll end up on. If we think that democracy can exist in a pain-free environment, that is probably a place where democracy is no longer active. It comes with a degree of pain. It comes with a degree of struggle. It's you have to be able to hear the heartbeat of democracy, and you know, it's not at a kind of resting rhythm. It has to be at an intensity. And of course, you know, decades and decades of peace have led to flabby democracies, and they've led to sclerotic bureaucracy. They've led to a wealth of issues that are not being tackled, and they've also led to a wealth of comfort and luxury, which means that we're very distant from the actual struggle that makes democracy worse. We're very distant from understanding what real tyranny feels like, and we're very distant from understanding what a really dysfunctional society feels like. So when these features start to invade our societies, we don't recognize those symptoms. I think that's what was happening in the US.
Yeah.
And then when it's accelerating as it is now, we don't have the tools and the culture to deal with it. But this isn't this is down to each individual and the role they play. And I think, my concluding piece was, it doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican or whatever. You have to be having a dialogue with people rather than screaming from your own bubble. You have to be engaged with this democracy, fighting for it. You have to be having arguments with people rather than hiding away in a little safe space.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I do the show.
It's going to disappear. That's why you do a show. That's the essence of it.
Break the rules. And this brings us to what I definitely wanted to mention here. A recent show that I had where I had Joseph Lindsley on, as well as Vladislav Davidson. And I also had the number 2 gentleman under Steve Bannon, Vish Burra. He was on the show, and we had a very productive, very good dialogue. What we came out from this dialogue with was that Trump and his whole group there think that they can wrestle Russia out of the grasp of China. And what Vish told us is that we need to show that this is a quote-unquote fool's errand. And I think that that is something that a lot of the pro-Ukraine side has not really been focusing on as much. If we understand that there is this Machiavellian lack of honor mentality here, might is right, whatever you want to call it, and again, we could say that this is just another repeat of the cycle of history where we have these strong men, not good men, not great men, not smart men, but strong men who are willing to just use raw power, for specific ends, then their interest should be making sure that a greater power is not going to bully them like they think they may be able to get away with bullying other countries here. And this is where China comes in, because Russia, I don't consider Russia to be an independent nation. I consider them to be subservient to China, and this also goes to this medieval mentality, back when you had somebody like Saint Alexander Nevsky, who was working for the Golden Horde, for the Mongolians, and he was, setting fire to villages that would not pay tribute to the Golden Horde. So this is the kind of mentality that a lot of Russian people, unfortunately, grew up with, going from there to Russians being serfs, practically living, in this animalistic way, under what was a European power, where you had, the Tsar of Russia, who was cousin to, the King of England. So it was a completely different world, the world of the people on top versus the people on the bottom. And then you had those people being weaponized by, Joseph Stalin. And, the mentality there was, well, I may be in the gulag for doing absolutely, nothing to warrant it, but it's not Stalin's fault. Daddy Stalin loves me. And so that kind of mentality, I think, it's a very toxic mentality to have.
Extremely toxic. And actually, Russia in the late 19th century, early 20th century was getting further away from that than it is now. This is the irony. It was a more sophisticated, more interesting place with more potential, especially after the 1905 revolution, than it is now. And that's a deeply sort of troubling thought. I mean, on that idea, yes, empires will always play these kind of games. And actually, the last 80 years is almost an aberration under the American age and post-World War II. We started to move away from empires, or a different kind of empire, a more productive kind of imperial setup. And we're moving back to more of an 18th, 19th century, or even Dark Ages sensibility. But if you're going to play that game, the best way is to side with China against Russia and destroy the proxies and assets that China could perhaps utilize, because we have more leverage over China. They sell almost everything that we consume. All you have to do is to start sort of easing up on that, and China has big problems, big, huge problems. We're tackling this problem from completely the wrong end. We're going after the organ grinder. No, we're going after the monkey, not the organ grinder. And Yeah, I agree with you. You know, the strategy that you can peel Russia away from China is delusional and wrong, because Russia, for right or wrong, believes that it is utilizing China to degrade the West. And Russia is an agent of chaos.
But I think it's even deeper than that, though. I think that somebody like Putin genuinely respects China because he fears China. Because
he fears it. Yes,
he sees China as being sadistic,
Yeah.
sadistic enough to any country that's sadistic enough to lock its own people, you know, with a deadbolt and have them starve to death or lack of water, you know, during the pandemic. Any country that does that, Putin's like, those are my people right there.
Yeah, those are people. And he understands that. He doesn't understand, you know, I mean, he wouldn't look at somebody who's richer than him and have any respect for them. No, he only has that mechanic of power and the willingness to project violence. Trump has both these mechanics in his head, the mafia and the sort of mercantile hierarchies in his head. So he's got a slightly different value set, but also he will recognize when there's a powerful individual like Putin and have a degree of admiration for it. Now, China, I think, is far more fragile and yet far more stronger. You know, again, it's this contrast. If we want to win against the rising authoritarianism, then we tackle Russia first. We take them out of the game.
Yeah, because otherwise China uses Russia as a cudgel against the West.
Yes.
Because any territory that Russia acquires, you could say, well, that's a future territory that China would be able to acquire. You know, same for all of, you know, people say, well, just Eastern Europe. But the problem that I think a lot of Americans and a lot of Western Europeans don't see is that a lot of this comes down to both hard and soft power, where, for example, you have somebody like Gavin Newsom, you know, who was partying in these restaurants while the pandemic was going on, you know, a very hypocritical kind of figure, somebody who, again, you know, does not want to address a lot of these core problems in California. Somebody like him rolled out the red carpet when Xi Jinping came. They got rid of all the homeless, and they turned San Francisco, at least during that time, you know, into a much cleaner version of itself than it was before Xi Jinping arrived. So somebody like that, I imagine, you know, wants to impress Uncle Z. I don't want more people like that to eventually start being bought by this much greater power by that time of China, you know, with all these Russian resources.
Yes.
And that's what a lot of Americans don't see, that it's not like this overnight thing. Oh my God, the Russians are in Paris now. No, it'll work itself slowly. It'll work itself through all these deals where, you know, people want to get elected, and you know, that's how it's going to work.
You don't win Putin or Xi through flattery and being obsequious. Absolutely not. You take back some of the industrial power that you've ceded to them. You make sure, like Finland, you are have a certain level of independence for critical resources that you require for your security. Then you start playing games with them, saying, look, we can take this stuff away from you, this trade here, here, and here, but we won't, because we want a more constructive kind of relationship. So you've got to play a version of hardball with them. I think that could be far more powerful. Why would I say that? Because the threat of secondary sanctions caused China to massively withdraw support for Russia. That would be financial credits to individuals, to businesses, to the state, and even to the military-industrial complex. China essentially withdrew huge swathes of its increasing support for Russia under threat of secondary sanctions, which Biden, after 2.5 years, finally implemented. So we have tools. We are not powerless. This is where I think Trump is wrong. He believes, unfortunately, that the US is degraded and powerless to influence Russia and China. Nothing could be further from the truth. You know, the USA is got extraordinary leverage and tools.
Elon Musk doesn't help.
Musk doesn't help at all. No, he's bought into those ideas for one reason or another. I've been accused over the last couple of months, and I rather suspect some trolls have really got onto this. You know, one set of trolls will accuse me of being a Biden hater and going too far down the road of normalizing Trump. and others will accuse me of Trump derangement syndrome. It's, but yeah, I think there is a problem here that American power is being leveraged in the wrong way, or not even realized that these tools. And the videos I've been trying to create have been trying to point out what power and leverage Trump has if he was minded to use them. I'm not saying he will use them. I'm not making any comment about his moral and political stance. I'm just saying, look, this is what could happen if you did this, this, and this. Just trying to plant these ideas and opportunities. But we're living in a very febrile, weaponized space, unfortunately.
And isolated. I mean, this is, again, one of the reasons why I think these conversations, not even with like you and me, but with you, me, and other people who, like Vish, for example, why that would be very, very important. And again, the problem is not to convince people like Vish of something. It's Vish is bringing in front of you the situation as it is, not as we want it to be, where he understands that a lot of this stuff is high school. He said so as much himself, that there's a lot of these emotions based on things that didn't have to work out the way that they did, but there is this perception of Zelensky and people who are within his team of being, supporters of Biden, supporters of the Democrats, and against Trump and all of that. So a lot of this stuff is entangled in things that would be otherwise common sense. Like, again, my position is that when it comes to the migration problem, the problem of all these criminal gangs in the United States, these are serious issues that need to be taken care of. Certain issues you're not going to patiently, sort out every single detail. There's always, like Thomas Sowell said, there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs. There's always going to be trade-offs in terms of any decisions that are made. Sure, maybe the genius politicians that do not exist right now could figure out a way to do it in such a way that nothing really gets disturbed that much. But we're talking about ideals here. On the reality, it's much different, and we can only utilize the tools that we have. So again, my hope is that there's going to be people who are the next generation who are going to go the opposite route of a lot of other younger people, a lot of iPad babies. Imagine being a kid, growing up with an iPad being your instructor for life. A lot of those kids are going to have really bad attention spans, and they are going to be that much more zombified than any of the preceding generations. But at the same time, there's going to be, maybe like a 0.1% of people who rejected that growing up. And instead, they were able to utilize the internet in order to find content like Break the Rules, for instance, where I had a stream a couple of days ago, which was not talking about anything political. It was talking about the rebirth of tragedy with Uber Boyo and Essential Salts. Uber Boyo, by the way, Irish lad, very, very interesting guy, very cool guy. Same with Essential Salts, who was in Texas. And we were talking about Nietzsche's book, The Birth of Tragedy, and how much aesthetics play a role in our perception of reality and how they give us a reason to live. One of the very interesting things, just as an example, that Essential Salts pointed out in this conversation, which I think a lot of younger people watching this would gravitate towards, is, and I'm not saying that they would implement it, but they would understand the idea of it. When he was talking about the practice of, I don't remember the word, was it exclusion? When they would take somebody from Greece who was voted against and exile them. You know what I mean? Like that old tradition in ancient Greece of exiling one person who was deemed to be unpopular. How he described that being enacted was not from getting rid of somebody who was some troublemaker or some criminal. No. The idea would be to get rid of somebody who was actually at the top of their game. Why? Because having somebody who was seen as flawless would discourage people from having any kind of competition, because I can't measure up to, as a chess player, I can never measure up to Magnus Carlsen. But Magnus Carlsen retired, so now the field is once again open. So that kind of an idea of a positive competition, like you were talking about earlier, where there is like a goal of what exactly does it mean to be a human being, what is honor, what are the principles that we're living for, for there to be healthy competitions engaged in determining that and guiding the future. I think it's actually going to be a lot easier than now because like 90% of the population is already going to be hooked to AI and they're going to be zombies. So I think that that environment is actually going to be a lot easier for the people who are not the zombies to be able to manage over time. I mean, now I am getting a little bit into the realm of sci-fi, but not really, because a lot of people are powered by these algorithms today as far as the kind of things that they observe on a daily basis. So I'm curious, like my predictions of the future, any thoughts on that, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think to an extent the politics we're seeing is already algorithm driven. I know someone like Vlad Vekla, who's a political social philosopher, has done a lot of videos about this. But I certainly think this is, in a different age, in a pre-internet, pre-iPad age, Trump would not have come to the fore, would not have won. We wouldn't be seeing this phenomenon because technology is intimately linked to the kind of politics that we have, and we are already algorithm guided to be more confrontational, to be more isolated, to have a diminution of trust. All these factors are exacerbated by the technology. I mean, people forget that the rise of Nazism, fascism, etc., also coincided with other technological revolutions, the introduction of radio, and that's the bit that kind of gets sort of lost. I mean, this is the impression I get from rereading Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, the extraordinary role that technology, telephones and radio play in that novel. There is this conduit and enabler for the evil that's rising up. I think it's an interesting point there. And yet the internet is so much more powerful in the way it's able to shape people's realities. Unfortunately, I'm also a bit of a sci-fi nut, and this is going to get exponentially worse. And I don't think our culture, our political culture, will keep up. Evolving, like an immune system, information and immune system, we cannot keep up with the advances in technology in that sense. So I do not see it stabilizing at any point soon.
There is a strange silver lining, though, if you will entertain this thought for a moment, that back in the old days, again, like 300, 500 years ago, most people weren't really participating in these greater ideas or democracy. Like, most people were satisfied, well, I wouldn't say satisfied, but they were living off their, land and farming and doing all that kind of stuff. And it doesn't mean that they had to live like an animalistic life like the serfs. I am curious. I just generally don't know what life was like for a lot of peasants, let's say, in England. I imagine it was better than a lot of the Russian serfs, but at the same time, not great. But the reason why I'm saying this is that most of those people, they didn't really have the levers of power like they did in the democracies that came about later on.
Doesn't mean they're ignorant, though. And
no, they're not ignorant.
Not at all. Yeah,
no.
I think constantly surprised at that. I mean, let's say I rather suspect that the disparity between the poorest and the richest was less than it is now. Ironically,
there were more books to read, right? At a certain point.
But also the disparity between how, let's say, a Ukrainian peasant was living in sort of the early 19th century, and how an English peasant or an Irish peasant was living. I'm not sure, the difference is nearly as great as how someone in rural England now is comparable to someone in provincial Russia, right? So this disparity, the international disparity, as well as the disparity between rich, poor, and middle class, I think has actually increased. Although it's masked by a lot of technology and stuff.
I'm not saying economic differences here, just to be clear. And I'm not saying ignorance as far as general intelligence. What I mean specifically is participation in certain systems, where if you are somebody who is a farmer, you are going to know far more about your environment, about the climate, about the changing of the seasons, when what has to be planted, far more than some upper class fuddy-duddy who has maids doing everything for him. Like that's
No, yes. But
that's a
there's a
given.
divorce, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a divorce from that reality. And then even people in different classes would not have been as divorced from those realities as people are now. And it depends. And obviously you would have had aristocrats who were bankrupt their families. And there's plenty of examples
no, absolutely.
there.
There's a different transition of elites. No, but the main point that I'm
there
getting to
are
here,
others who would have had much more connection with the reality of how their money comes from, how it's made. And
sure, absolutely. But the main thing here is that democracy led to a lot of people today being undereducated, if you will, or not really as connected with life, whether we're talking about planning certain things, more of just tubes to receive information from advertisers and all the things that they see through the algorithm, and then regurgitating that information back.
Well, yes, there's that, definitely. And there's also, combine that with the longer term trend, which is the absolving yourself of a role in that problem solving, which I think is something that's come about over the last couple of decades, where you look to central authorities to solve all your problems and then blame them when that doesn't happen. Whereas Ukrainian approach is to kind of assume that central government's going to be a crap, and there will be gaps. And, if this is going to get solved, hey, we're going to have to find a solution ourselves. And I think if somehow Western democracy can be revived, and this is an era where Joe and I, democracy isn't a process of voting and then sitting back and screaming or pointing from the sidelines, or even forgetting about democracy till you vote again in 5 years' time. No, it's a mass participatory system, and that's the process we kind of need to relearn. And education plays a key role, but what education? I mean, the education cannot be that discourages people from the active involvement. So again, there are multiple layers of this, and maybe it's through example. Maybe it's through example, and maybe it is, to your phrase, it's adversity that jolts people out of that and gets them once again thinking, talking. I was at the pub yesterday, and I was amazed to hear that there's a whole bunch of guys behind me who normally would talk about nothing but football or whatever, or intrigues at work, football, whatever. They were talking about football, but they were also talking about the theater of what went on in the White House, and doing it in, I was surprised to hear, remarkably sophisticated and energetic fashion.
Well, that doesn't surprise me, because when it comes to British people in general, my experience is that they are much better at talking about various concepts, even if those concepts are not that relative to their particular experience in life than Americans are.
No.
At least that's just my experience here. But the silver lining that I was alluding to earlier here, which, it's not a great one by any means, and it's a step down, I'd say, from this, better connection, like you were alluding to earlier, that the elites of, 300 years past had to the people who were, living in the land, and vice versa. That there was among those people, and again, I didn't live there, but I assume from the conversation we're having here and from what you've learned, that there was a greater appreciation of the greater whole. Even if they didn't vote, they had a certain impact on the things that went in their local society and so on. Now we have this weird thing where people are voting for things that go way, way, way beyond their local society into geopolitics. The silver lining here, which again is not a great silver lining by any means, is I understand that you would want there to be democracy. But if people are incapable completely of being nothing than a tube for the algorithm, then that's a very dangerous situation as well. And the question is, would it be better for the people who are completely ignorant of anything other than what they've been regurgitated into, with these various news outlets and algorithmic functions? Would it be better for them to have a say here, or would it be better for them to spend more time inside of some virtual reality realm where they would be entertained like little children? And I'm not saying it's a
No.
great situation, but I don't know.
That's a very tricky one. I mean, we'll have to pick that up in the next one because I'm
Yes.
going to get to jump off now. But that mixes that makes us sound very much like the sort of the battery people in
Yes.
in the Matrix.
Yeah, or the wireheads.
And
Yeah,
you have to break out of that reality and take the I don't remember if it's the red pill or the blue pill.
the red pill.
The red pill. Take the red pill and see reality for what it is and struggle with it. This is a question which I don't have any answers to this. I certainly don't think it's healthy for someone like Musk to decide who gets the vote or not. It's certainly not a role of oligarchs to decide who has that agency or not. That is indistinguishable from dictatorship. But it is a question. It is a question as to whether people need to do some kind of competency test in order to vote. That criteria in Britain for a long time was material possession, which again is iniquitous, and it's not true democracy. But it produced a certain kind of I wouldn't even say stability, but it produced a certain kind of society. But
And skin in the game, if you know that your descendants.
Skin in the game is an important one.
Yeah.
But that skin should not just be material. It should be people who are in action and engaged, no matter their political thing. So it comes back to dialogue. It comes back to dialogue and being able to sort of talk and push like an expanding gas against a space. The minute that gas goes cold, that's kind of what we're seeing, is the system kind of dying. With that, I'm going to have to jump off. We hit 2 hours, which is a kind of record on the channel. And we've got in so many different directions, and also opened up lots of opportunities for future dialogue. And some of these debates I'm going to get massively into, debating and dialogues with people I don't agree with necessarily on all things.
I'd look forward to having you on BTR as well. And
we'll do a lot more of those.
And guys, you could find me on breaktherules.tv. That's the address which leads you right to YouTube. And if you want to support this, bring all these different people together. I had Curtis Yarvin debate with Vladislav Davidson of the Atlantic Council. I've had, as I mentioned before, quite recently, Vish Burra, who works for Steve Bannon, talking about the situation in Ukraine with J.P. Lindsley, and Vlad was in there as well. A lot of very interesting thinkers. Some of them are quite controversial, but that's the whole point, to be able to merge a lot of these worlds together in good faith. And if you guys want to support the show, breaktherules.tv is where you go for YouTube, and patreon.com/breaktherules. You go there and support the show. And if anybody here happens to live in New York City, I would very much love to meet you. And patrons, $20 patrons, get free access to the New York City events that I throw, where I record a session with these very interesting people, and then we go out for an after party.
That sounds great. I haven't been to New York since I was 4 years old, so about time I would
love to have you there. Absolutely.
Popped in, yeah. San Francisco and that area, I know that well, as I say, from the work I did. But yes, a long time since I've been to New York, and it would be good to do one of those live. Actually, I think, and important this year actually to do some live events on the road.
100%.
So let's talk about that. Lev, thanks so much. Real pleasure.
Thank you. Take care.